to the Army Resilience Roundup podcast. I am your podcast host, Lataria Walker. This podcast is a place where you can find resources that will help you build upon and maintain your resilience. Each episode will offer tips on how to successfully manage the responsibilities of everyday life. Together, we will learn, grow, and thrive. Together, we are resilient. Welcome to the Resilience Roundup podcast, episode 36. I am Lataria Walker, your podcast host. Today, our guest is Major General Retired Gregg F. Martin. Major General Martin, United States Army retired, is a 36-year combat veteran who is a bipolar survivor, thriver, and warrior. An airborne ranger, an engineer qualified soldier and strategist, he commanded a combat engineer company, battalion, and brigade, and was commanding general of Fort Leonard Wood, commandant of the Army War College, and president of the National Defense University. A West Point graduate, he holds a PhD and 2 master's degrees from MIT, as well as master's degrees from both the Army and Naval War Colleges. He has lived on the bipolar spectrum his entire life, which mostly helped him until he experienced a manic episode that nearly destroyed him. His life's mission is sharing his bipolar story to help stop stigma, promote recovery, and save lives. His wife, Maggie, is an Army brat, Army wife, and an Army mom to 3 sons, 2 Army Special Forces veterans, and 1 an artist. Martin is the author of Bipolar General, My Forever War with Mental Illness. Major General Retired Martin, sir, thank you so much for joining us. This episode's topic is the Bipolar General, My Forever War with Mental Illness. Let's begin our discussion. So you went from decades of achievement to a sudden manic episode. Walk us through the moment you realized something serious was happening. What did that feel like from the inside?
I actually was working my way unknowingly up the bipolar spectrum for many years, even decades. So it wasn't a sudden manic episode. It was a gradual build with higher and higher levels of mood, then eventually went into full-blown mania, which was kind of the beginning of the end. The first time I realized something was wrong was when we got back from the Iraq War, and I went from very, very high-level energy to depression. I knew there was something wrong, and I had more depressive episodes over the next several years between 2003 and 2014. When I would go into depression, I knew there was something wrong. And 3 different times I went to the doctors voluntarily, and each time they said, "Oh, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you." They were basically blinded by my success. But when I did go into the full-blown mania, again, because I was in mania, I didn't think there was anything wrong. Even when I was fired from my job and forced to retire, it didn't faze me. I just said, hey, this is God at work. He's going to put me in a bigger job, do bigger things. But then I spiraled and crashed into crippling depression. I was unfunctional. I was terrified by my psychosis, that I was going to be spied on, arrested, murdered in jail. And when all of that depression and psychosis came together after the full-blown mania, then I knew there's something really wrong because I could hardly function. And I went in voluntarily back to Walter Reed, back to the doctors and said, hey, doctor, there's something really wrong. Please help me out. And then it was on that day in November of 2014, I finally got a correct diagnosis of bipolar disorder and psychosis.
So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs gave you an impossible sounding ultimatum. You know, that's a really big deal. How did you process that choice? resign or be fired and get evaluated? And what were the immediate consequences for your career and identity?
He said, look, you've done a great job. I love you like a brother. I give you a grade of A plus, but your time at National Defense University is over. You have till 5 p.m. to resign or I'm going to fire you. And I was so manic that I said, thank you, General Dempsey. This is great news. God put me here to do big things. He's going to move me somewhere else to do even bigger things. So the mania and my state of mind really protected me because I never really even thought about not just resigning. I'm like, hey, he's my boss. He made the decision that there's something that compelled him to get rid of me and fire me. So I'm just going to resign. And I just went and wrote up a resignation letter. And so it was really not a hard decision, but I'm really fortunate that I made that decision because there's a big difference between being relieved for cause or fired and voluntarily stepping down. If you actually get fired, then there's a lot of implications with regard to potential rank that when you retire, possibly your retirement pay. So there's administrative, legal, rank, financial things that come into play if you're actually fired. But he helped me out by giving me the choice to resign. So the immediate thing that happened is he said, okay, go report back to the Army. And they had called the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. So I literally walked down the hall out of the chairman's office down to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, reported to him, and he said, hey, welcome back to the Army from the Joint Staff world. And we talked about what I would do next in terms of a follow-on job, my retirement date, and that sort of thing. So that was the immediate ramification. And I ended up going to work for the Army Corps of Engineers, Lieutenant General Tom Bostic. That was my follow-on assignment from National Defense University.
Wow. So it sounds like your mania protected you from the reality to a certain degree. That's very interesting. So in your book, you describe plunging into hopeless depression and terrifying psychosis. Can you share a more specific memory from that period that helps listeners sort of understand what bipolar psychosis feels like?
There were many different things that happened in terms of delusions and hallucinations and seeing things and feeling things that weren't real. For example, I thought I could fly. I thought I saw the Holy Spirit descend from heaven. I thought I saw a pack of demons flying and attacking our house at Fort McNair. But the most prominent one was that I had this overwhelming fear that I absolutely believed that the people that I had been in charge of at NDU had turned against me and that they were spying on me, watching me, my every move, tapping my phones, watching me 24/7, and that they were finding things that they thought were illegal that I had done, and that they were reporting me to, the legal authorities, and that it was only a matter of time that I was going to get arrested, tried, convicted of crimes against the government, put in jail, and in jail I would be tortured, beaten, murdered, stabbed to death, and die gurgling in a pool of my own blood. That was the most pronounced one. And it went through my mind continuously, and I was constantly on the lookout. I mean, I would go out from the house and I would look, behind the bushes, behind the tree, over behind the other building. Where are they? Where are they watching me from? And I was just absolutely terrified that this was all going to come true, and that not only would I be murdered, but that I would lose all pay, benefits, retired pay, and which would really hurt my wife, who would need the Army retirement. So it was just a terrifying experience. And of course, the whole thing was pretty much a product of my own psychotic mind. There was like very little truth or reality behind it.
Wow. So when you finally received the diagnosis of bipolar with psychosis, what emotions and thoughts followed? Was it relief, confusion, anger, grief, or was it something else?
Relief was a big part of it. I knew at that point in this deep depression with this psychosis that there was something really wrong. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know I had bipolar disorder. I didn't know any of that. And I had been evaluated 6 previous times, and the doctors said, "You're fine. There's nothing wrong with you." Of course, I wasn't fine. I had raging bipolar disorder in my brain. But when the doctor said, "Okay, you're depressed now," and your wife, who was in the meeting, said you were manic before, then he was able to connect the dots, ask some questions, put the pieces together and say, "Okay, you have bipolar disorder with psychosis." And when he said that, I felt a huge sense of relief that finally here is a doctor, a medical professional saying, "This is what you have. This is your condition. Here's what the problem is. And we can treat this. We can treat it with medication, with therapy, with healthy living. We can get you on a course to recover, regain your life, and start living a normal, healthy, happy life again." So right then and there in the office, I said, "Hey, thank you, doctor. This is really good news. I am going to embrace this. I'm going to own it. I'm going to manage it. And I'm determined to get healthy again, get better, and regain my life."
So let's talk a bit about your treatment journey. I know it included, hospitalizations, multiple medications, therapies, and even an ECT. Which parts were the hardest to accept? And were there any turning points during treatment that really gave you a reason to hope?
So after the appointment with the doctor that November 2014 at Walter Reed, he prescribed me some medications. And we had follow-on appointments. We were meeting twice a week, and then once a week, and then every other week. Actually, all the way until I left several months later and retired. But the medications didn't work. They didn't work inside my brain. They did not change the course of my bipolar illness. I continued to get worse. None of the symptoms went away. My psychosis got worse. My depression got worse. The only thing the medications did was I put on some weight and they made me very sleepy and groggy. That was a huge disappointment. It was tough to swallow that they couldn't give me something that worked. Then I retired from the Army, moved to New Hampshire, connected with a civilian psychiatrist, and the medications he gave me didn't work either. Nothing was changing the course of this severe bipolar illness. My depression just remained intractable, and the psychosis just continued to torture me. And then I started therapy, and the therapy didn't do anything for me. It just was, I was frustrated because none of this stuff was working. A positive turning point came in March of 2016 when I admitted myself into a VA hospital in Vermont. That was a positive step because I said, I am now going to be working with a team of medical professionals who are all focused on me, getting me the right treatment, helping me to get better. So checking into the VA hospital to the psychiatric ward really did lift my morale. But again, they didn't get me on the right medications. So I didn't really get better. I felt good that I was in a hospital getting treated, but it didn't make me get better. So I was very discouraged when after several months, the ECT, electric convulsive therapy, I did 14 rounds of that, thought it would help, but it didn't. Nothing was working. It wasn't until August of 2016, several months after my hospitalization, that my wife called my doctor and said, "Hey, doctor, it's not working. We need to try something different. And the doctor said, well, the gold standard for treating bipolar disorder is lithium, but lithium comes with a number of side effects that you need to be aware of. But if your husband is willing to do this, we can, move on to lithium. And so I thought about it, did a little research, talked to the doctor, said, yes, let's do it. Let's give it a try. And within less than a week of going on to lithium, my depression lifted. The psychosis went away. All of the morbid, passive, suicidal ideations went away. That was really the start of my recovery back to health. So that was just a huge morale booster, that I actually was getting better and that the lithium was changing the course of the illness. So it didn't just get rid of the symptoms. It actually went inside my brain and changed the course of the bipolar illness so that I began a path to recovery and good health.
Wow, so that leads me right into my next point here because I do want to talk a bit more about lithium. And I know that you credit lithium with playing a major role in your recovery. So let's take it a step further and have you explain in layman's terms what exactly did it do for you, and why do you think it was different from any other treatments that you had tried in the past?
Well, lithium is really a unique medication. It's completely natural. It's Li3 on the periodic chemical table. It actually is harvested out of the earth. It's salt. It's a natural salt that is then purified, refined, and turned into a medication. Pharmaceutical companies did not invent it. There's virtually no profit to be made on it by almost anybody. And so it's not promoted strongly the way other medications are. But for me, the lithium salts go into the brain, they go into the chemistry and the wiring of the brain, and they affect the synapses in such a way that, to put it in simple terms, it put a ceiling and a floor inside of my brain that controlled my mood states. So if my bipolar brain decided, okay, let's flare up into mania, let's start overproducing the dopamine and the endorphins and the serotonin that cause mania, basically I would start going up, and then the lithium would create a ceiling, if you will, that the rising mood would bump into and then be kept within a tolerable, safe, normal band. On the other end, it creates a floor that prevents falling into depression. So again, with a bipolar brain, the brain on its own, because of the illness, decides, okay, I'm going to underproduce dopamine, endorphins, serotonin, which will then cause me to go into depression. And so as I start going into depression, the lithium creates a floor, a barrier that prevents my mood from plunging any further into depression. So with the ceiling and the floor, you've got an upper and a lower barrier that keeps me in this safe, steady, healthy mood zone and keeps me in a good place.
That's an excellent explanation. Thank you so much. So, how did this entire experience change your view of leadership or duty in the military culture around mental health? Did it shift how you think leaders should respond when one is struggling with their own mental health?
Yes, it definitely shifted things, because once I realized that I had bipolar disorder and then was able to, look historically and do research and realize that I had had bipolar disorder for many, many years in the military, and I was very successful, but my symptoms of both mania and depression were quite clear. I mean, they were there for everybody that I worked with to see. The problem was all those people around me, my bosses, my peers, my subordinates, good people. For the most part, I was extremely successful. People liked working with me. I was very successful. My units were successful. Everything was going great, but they were untrained. They didn't have the basic fundamental knowledge about mental health that every person in the military, and I would say everybody in society, should have. I mean, people should all take a psychological first aid class similar to physical first aid. Everybody in the military should know the basics of mental health, that these are the most common mental health conditions. And within each of those conditions, here are the most common symptoms. Here's what the symptoms look like. Here's how to identify them. Here's how to have a conversation with somebody who is experiencing these symptoms. Here's how to encourage them to go seek professional military help. So these are all part of the training that should be happening for everybody in the military from day one, so that you don't have a situation like me where I had serious mental illness. People were all around me. They saw it, but they didn't know what they were seeing because they weren't trained. So I think we can, really correct that. And I think everybody needs to realize that mental health is just as important as physical health. Having a healthy brain, a strong, healthy brain, is probably the most important aspect of good health and high performance. So people, having this appreciation, this awareness, putting the time, the thinking, the effort into mental health as part of the way we do business is something that I really, really believe strongly in. And I will give the military some credit. They've improved a lot in the last 20 years, both understanding, training, awareness, treatment, making accommodations for people with mental health conditions that in past years they might have, almost automatically separated. So I do think the military is moving in the right direction. And I think, your program, the Army G1 prevention program, is, that's a good example of moving in the right direction.
Wonderful. Let's shift a bit into your recovery. We know that recovery often includes rebuilding, relationships and routines. What practical steps helped you rebuild your life? And what support from family, friends, or even professionals mattered the most to you?
When I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder and I started doing the research on it, I realized that someone who has serious bipolar disorder can almost be thought of as a wrecking ball, swinging wildly, crushing relationships, destroying friendships, destroying trust. And so I thought about all the people that I had relationships, friendships, etc., with, family, professional friendships, and others. I thought about, okay, who may I have harmed or hurt when I was in, a significant bad bipolar state? And I got a hold of every single one. And I said, hey, I have bipolar disorder. It's very, very destructive. I may very well have said or did things that were hurtful and that harmed, your trust in me, our friendship, our relationship. And I just want to tell you, I apologize. I'm sorry. It wasn't me being myself because, the illness pretty much took over my brain and my personality. But that's not an excuse. I'm not blaming it on the bipolar, and I'm giving you my sincere apology. And so I did that, personally. I wrote it in articles where I apologized to people. I put it in the book. And I think that is really important, to take ownership and responsibility for behavior, maybe even was totally caused by the bipolar, but take ownership and, try to do your best to make it right with these people. Most people that I did that with said, thank you for telling me. I understand, I forgive you. I don't hold it against you. I don't think it was your fault. You weren't being yourself. I understand what a powerful mental illness, bipolar disorder is. There are other people who, refuse to accept the apology, who wouldn't return my phone calls, return a text. They wouldn't return an email. They wouldn't meet me in person. And they have held a grudge against me, and they hold a very strong stigma against me and the mental illness. And so that's unfortunate. It's sad, but it's true, and it's not unusual for people who are dealing with the aftermath of, really bad mental illness.
Wow, thank you for that. Many soldiers worry that seeking help could affect their careers or change how they're seen by their leaders and peers. For those soldiers who may be struggling in silence, what advice would you share with them about taking that step to get the behavioral health counseling or treatment they need?
If they or a battle buddy believe or think or concerned they may have a mental health condition, they absolutely must go get professional medical help. They should look at it no differently than if they blew out their knee or their back or shoulder. Go get medical help. The fear that it could have professional career repercussions is real. It is a concern, but they have to look at it like this. If they do have a mental illness or a mental condition and they don't go get help, there's a very strong chance that this thing is going to get worse and worse, and that it's going to blow up on them. It's going to ruin their career anyway. It's going to ruin their marriage, their family, their health. There's a good chance they'll become homeless, addicted, get in trouble with the law, get incarcerated, get violently beat up, assaulted, killed, and then ultimately maybe even suicide. So if they don't get help, that's the likely path. But if you do get help and you do get treatment, then you can live a happy, healthy, purposeful life, whether it's retained in the military or outside of the military as a civilian. So I think it's a matter of really life and potential death to go get help.
Thank you for that, sir. If there is one takeaway you want our audience to glean from today's episode, what would that be?
If in doubt or in question, either for yourself, for a family member, for a fellow service member, go get medical help, professional medical help, and get evaluated. There's probably a good chance you're going to be found to be okay. But if there is a problem, you need professional help. Then if you do get a diagnosis, embrace it, own it, manage it, and move forward, working with your medical professionals and living, a really healthy lifestyle. Make connections with people. Never doubt that you can get better. Always maintain hope, because hope will give you energy and inspiration. It'll keep you moving and keep you alive.
Excellent discussion today, sir. Thank you so much. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners before we close?
The military is a hard profession. It puts a lot of stress on people. There are probably many of our listeners who entered the military with an already existing mental health condition, but they didn't know it. And then the stress of serving in the military triggers it, and it comes alive, and it's now in action in your life. So you're not alone. There's, many people, 20% of the global population are living with some sort of mental illness. They're afflicted and they're suffering from it. The other 80% are affected by virtue of being family, friend, work colleague. So you are not alone. Virtually everybody needs to recognize the reality of mental illness and mental health conditions, and then get on with taking care of it.
Sir, thank you so much for joining us today and having this very informative discussion with our listeners. Thank you for your candor and your transparency. Listeners, I hope you heard something today that will encourage you to continue on your path to recovery, wholeness, and good mental health. Thank you again for listening and have an amazing day. Thank you for joining us for this month's Army Resilience Roundup podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please continue to Army Resilience Directorate on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. Please note that the views of DPRR podcast guests are their very own and are not endorsed by the Department of the Army or the Department of Defense. Stay resilient.